behalf of our members and our co-host FMI, the Food Industry Association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to another in our series of digital dialogues on race, inclusion, and diversity in the food system. As the food and agriculture community continue our journey to learn and improve our performance on diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a growing appreciation for the business value of having a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. More diverse companies are more creative and have better problem solving, improved decision-making, increased profitability and productivity, enhanced employee engagement and retention, and a better reputation. In short, diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business. Now, in today's digital dialogue, we're fortunate enough to have two experts who focus on increasing diversity in the supply chain, which is a growing trend and an expectation among leading food companies. Terrez Thompson, chair of Powered by Zerret Incorporated and a retired executive of the Coca-Cola Company, and Natalie McGrady, director of Supplier Diversity at Cargill. We'll discuss the business case for diversity in the supply chain, including what companies should look for in suppliers, common traits among suppliers, championing a more diverse and inclusive environment, and advice for fostering one. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our friend and partner, David Fikes, Executive Director of the FMI Foundation, our co-sponsor of the Digital Dialogues, to offer his welcome. David?
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it so much. And it is my pleasure on behalf of Leslie Saracen, the CEO and president of FMI, to add my welcome to you, those of you that are joining us, and to thank you for participating in today's digital dialogue, the fourth in our series. You know, I learned a long time ago that there is a powerful difference between hearing something and listening. Hearing something is a physiological function. We are constantly hearing things, taking in sounds with our ears, most of which we subconsciously just tune out. Listening, on the other hand, is a psychological act. It is something we do by choice and intention. It is an act of the will, and it is something that requires intense concentration and focused discipline. And the difference between listening and hearing is made by the funny because it's true t-shirt caption that says, "My wife says there are several things that I don't do well. The first is I don't listen to her, and the others are, well, I forget what they are." We may hear involuntarily, but we are listening, and only when it becomes a conscious choice. And there are different motives that drive our desire to engage the discipline of listening. Sometimes we listen because we want to appreciate something, like a great piece of music. Perhaps more often these days, we choose to listen because we want to learn something, or because we need to evaluate or analyze a piece of data. But in the realm of relationships, we most likely call upon our ability and discipline to listen because we want to understand the feelings of another person. CFI and FMI are jointly engaged in providing these digital dialogues, addressing the issue of racial justice, diversity, and inclusion because we think that there are concerns, experiences, and opinions in these areas that need more than just to be sounded out and heard. They warrant being listened to carefully. We appreciate your engagement with these opportunities, and we hope they provide you with the chance to sharpen your listening skills, learning to appreciate the experiences of others, listening to learn something, or listening to evaluate how systems that are in place can result in very different experiences depending on the color of your skin. And finally, listening because you truly want to understand the feelings of another human being. So welcome to our fourth digital dialogue. And as my fifth grade teacher used to say, let's all put on our listening ears.
Excellent. Good advice, David. Thank you for that. And before I turn it over to our facilitator, Ayanna Webster, I want to share the details on a new resource that's going to be available soon. We're finalizing a guide for facilitating meaningful discussions about race in the workplace. It's designed to support discussions in any organization with a focus on frontline workers and frontline managers. Now, it's in the final stages of design and beta testing, and it'll be available soon on the CFI website. And I want to thank Ayanna and her team for creating the content, and my colleague Jenny Nguyen for her project leadership, and thanks to Dairy Farmers of America for beta testing that new tool. Now, here's what we need from you during the digital dialogue. We need for you to ask questions of our guests and of Ayanna. The way to do that, since everyone's line is muted, is to go to the Q&A icon on the toolbar, Q&A, and submit your questions. We'll be filtering those throughout the conversation, and Ayanna will ask as many of those as we can during our time available to Terrez and Natalie. So submit your questions through the Q&A box. We'll get to as many as we can. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ayanna to begin today's digital dialogue. Ayanna, it's all yours.
All righty. Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Dave. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, as Charlie said, my name is Ayanna Webster, and I'm the Principal Consultant for Winning Within and Associates. And I have the privilege to be here for another digital dialogue this afternoon. I'd like to begin our discussion by asking our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to also, as we do at each dialogue, share their why for this conversation and just talk a little bit about their background and why the conversation on racial justice, inclusion, and diversity is important to them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terrez.
Well, good afternoon. And first, I want to just take a moment to say, wow, David, you know, I do a lot of these and I'm always surprised and moved. And, because you don't want to get cynical. So I really appreciated that. So I am Terrez Thompson. I'm a 40-year executive in business. I worked for the Coca-Cola Company for 35 years. And I tell people, I'm sort of a recovering CPA who happened to stumble into diversity. So I spent a lot of time in finance and operations in the food industry through Coke. And just like I said, stumbled into Supplier Diversity. And it kind of brought me kicking and screaming, but now I'm all in. And that's why I got the opportunity to retire with Coke. And I created my own nonprofit where I will continue the journey, developing women of color business owners, mostly in the informal sector, providing them with coaching and small grants and other disadvantaged entrepreneurs. So that is my why, but also the reason that I'm here is that this industry has done a lot for me, has allowed me to do this. And, I'm one of those people that I'm really not sick of having a discussion with those who want to be my ally. I think that I have been blessed in so many ways. And yeah, it does get tiring, but having these sorts of discussions really help to move the needle, even if in small doses. And as I said, the opening from David is just a proof point of that. So I'm all in. This is my life's work, and I'm excited to have the conversation.
Thanks, Terrez, and looking forward to learning more about your work with your company as well as your long tenure coach. And we'll go with Natalie now.
Well, hello, good afternoon. My name is Natalie McGrady, and I was an accountant for about 2 years, and I decided that was not my life's calling at all. So that's one thing Terrez and I have in common. She loves accounting. So I've been working in corporate America since the 90s and have really spent most of my time working in manufacturing companies such as Corning Incorporated. I also worked for a company called Pentair. And then I moved into this food services or food area. And I worked for Winn-Dixie stores and then Cargill. So I've been at Cargill almost 11 years now. Started out as a category leader, managing large teams, supporting our businesses for our indirect sourcing. And now I've moved into Supplier Diversity. And Supplier Diversity was not the place that I wanted to go. I did not see my career moving this way. I really thought it wasn't the job for me. I wanted to prove that as a woman of color or the woman in sourcing and procurement, I could do these more technical categories, such as plant services, plant equipment, things like that. So it's been an interesting journey. I've grown to love it over the last almost 4 years now. So civil rights and inclusion is deep into my family. We are, I'm the youngest of 6 girls. My father worked for Ford Incorporated as the director of community relations, and he was that person who was the liaison between the company and the community, fighting for civil rights for all. So it's kind of seeped into me. My mother, the same way, she was very much leading some of those efforts as well. So that's my why. I really like Terrez, enjoy the conversation. I don't mind the argument. It's all in love and really trying to move the needle forward. So that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Natalie. And if you would maybe lean in a little bit to your computer audio. I'm having just a little bit of difficulty hearing you, or either switch perhaps to the phone. So as Natalie's doing that, thank you. So as Natalie's doing that, what I would like to do is share our 4 agreements of courageous conversation as we start the questions and the dialogue for today. And so these 4 agreements are really agreements that we use to make progress on sometimes difficult subjects like today around racial justice, inclusion, and diversity. Recognizing these agreements will empower us to have a safe, transparent, and hopefully a productive conversation on today. So I'd like to, as you can see them on the screen, at a high level, just kind of share what these agreements are as we move into the conversation. So the first is, we just ask that you will remain fully and wholly committed to the dialogue, resisting the human nature to disengage, whether that be morally or emotionally or intellectually. Typically, we disengage based off of something that we hear that is not similar to our own experiences. So I would encourage you to stay engaged, experience discomfort. We acknowledge that these conversations can be and are sometimes uncomfortable for all of us. However, talking about it removes the divide and it brings us together. And here is where the healing and the change will begin. Speak your truth. Simply put, what we mean by this is be open about your thoughts and your feelings, not simply just saying or asking the questions that we think our panelists want to be asked today or what they want to hear. Again, we ask that you would just speak your personal truth and ask the questions that you really want the answers to. And then finally, accept and expect non-closure. In our desire for real change, we know that we want to rush to quick solutions, but we understand that we're not going to be able to have full closure on today, and there's going to likely be some uncertainty, and that's okay. It's this ongoing dialogue that we're having that informs necessary and meaningful actions beyond today. So with that, what I would like to do is thank you all for acknowledging these agreements and helping us to have a safe and transparent conversation on today. I'd like to begin by just asking a question of both of our panelists. And that question is, Natalie and Terrez, in your opinion, why more than ever should the industry, the food industry specifically, care about addressing diversity, inclusion, racial justice? Why more than ever?
It looks like Natalie is still on mute, so I'll start that discussion. So I don't have to tell you all in the audience that the food industry touches everybody's life, everything that we do. It is a large part of the sustainability discussion as it relates to underserved communities, you know, the food deserts, the access, and the possibility of the impact of trade on pricing. And so, I mean, it's just sort of a fundamental business concept that if your value chain, your consumers and your customers are impacted, the only way that you will truly be able to address their needs and their concerns is to truly understand them. And also going back to, again, that statement, if you're not listening to hear what's going on, you are leaving money on the table. So there is the altruistic social impact piece, but we're in a capitalistic society, which I'm very much in favor of. And if you're leaving stuff on the table, you won't be successful and you definitely can't do good. So I think there is an obvious case for why the food industry should be here. It's pervasive, And if you're not touching all of your consumers, you're missing out. And then, you know, more than anything else, it sounds like your leaders think you need to do it. So if you want to keep your jobs, that's just another good reason. But I do think there's a holistic, powerful impact reason as well. But there are some, you know, reasons like that too.
Absolutely. Natalie?
Mhm.
So it looks like we may not have audio yet from you, Natalie. If you want to try perhaps adjusting your audio. I'll go back over to Terrez. You started talking a little bit about that business case, right, for inclusion and diversity in the food industry.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about what is that foundational business case as you've seen it for diversity and inclusion in the food system?
I'm going to start kind of tying into what I said before, and then I'll get a little bit more into kind of what we fundamentally think of as sort of return on investment business cases. One of the last things that I did at the Coca-Cola Company was to engage a diverse firm who had a really crazy idea. And I think Natalie was a part of that too, but many of us in the food and beverage industry actually signed on to really understand if there was a tangible impact, not normally your economic impact and what have you, or the fact that your consumers know it, to diversity and inclusion. And what this group found is that consumers who believe that your business is contributing to diversity and supplier diversity actually not only think more favorably of your brand by something like 40%, but knowing that 25% of them also would actually it increases their purchase intent. So that means it actually would increase them wanting to buy a Coca-Cola in the case of our company, but many others found the same thing. And then I also say, as it relates to inclusion and diversity, you know, if you, again, like I said before, are, you know, you touch everything, and that includes diverse communities, and your business practices should do that. But also there's just the fundamental basics of, you know, keeping and retaining your workforce. You know, especially these young millennials and the other generations that are coming in, they look for companies who are trying to contribute to social impact. And I would imagine that especially in, you know, the food industry, the dairy group who is being the pilot, that probably is something that they have to think about. You know, how do we attract people into our industry? So those are the things that I would think about. I'm going to let Natalie speak since she's had some time, and I'll add if I can after she speaks, because I know she's done a lot of work at Cargill around the business case.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me now? Yes.
You're good, Natalie.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, great. And I think the question was around why should we care about this at our companies? Why should companies be thinking about inclusion and diversity in the supply chain? And the biggest reason, I think, like Terrez talked about, is retention of employees, but also the piece around ensuring that we are doing our part to ensure the economic impact is there for the communities that we work and live in. And that's our goal at Cargill. And we talk about that a lot. And I liken it to what we do with our people diversity. You know, you don't go into companies anymore without a panel of people that are diverse. So why would we not go into with a panel of suppliers that are diverse? And we're specifically focused on Black farmer equity at Cargill. We just had an announcement talking about that, the racial equity in farming. And we will be putting together listening sessions with the National Black Growers Council and 100 ranchers to discuss how do we start to move the needle forward? What are the barriers to success or the barriers to entry as we think about Blacks in farming in the United States?
Excellent. And so I would ask everyone as you're listening today, remember that you can send your questions through the Q&A function. I have a few questions that were sent in advance for both Natalie and Terrez. One question, we have a diverse audience today. We have some that might be suppliers as well as corporations on the call today. So one question that was raised is, what common traits do you see amongst suppliers who are doing a good job with diversity, equity, and inclusion? And again, that could be from diverse suppliers or looking specifically at diverse supply chains.
Would you like to start, or would you like me to start, Natalie? Okay, so that is right up
both of our alleys. I would say those businesses that are thinking about either enhancing or starting a supplier diversity function. First, I would say, the very first thing that you should do is, know your data. Understand what your baseline is and where you are. Don't jump out with it as a public relations ploy, because that's not sustainable. I mean, you can do that because there could be some good reasons for doing that. But if you really want a sustainable program, and I say really, let's stop looking at these as programs. Let's look at them as integrated business functions. So a couple of things that I will say is that you need to have strong leadership. And procurement leadership is good, but your business leaders, preferably even your CEO or your chairman or your president, really have to walk the talk and talk the talk. It's just a stakeholder change management thing. If you're doing something in your function and it's not focused by the leadership, folks just aren't going to do it. And that's understandable. That's just human nature. The other thing that I would say is, have some clearly identified goals. Again, don't try to boil the ocean. Be reasonable and practical. I mean, we want to be aspirational, but again, we want it to be sustainable. And probably, like in most cases, there are low-hanging fruit there. So if you know your baseline and you kind of know what you're spending, there are probably suppliers in there that you didn't even realize were diverse suppliers. And then understand what diversity is and define it and be really clear in your messaging around that. And then I would say, from my perspective, it has to be resourced. You can't just bring in someone, give them a travel budget and say, go. It's a function. It's a procurement function. You've got to identify suppliers. You may have to develop suppliers. You do need to travel, but you have to do matchmaking. You've got to bring people in. You've got to have not just resources, dollars, which is important, but you also have people who have to be committed, especially those key decision makers. And then, Natalie, do you want to add as it relates to corporations, or do you want me to go to suppliers and then you answer both questions? How would you like to do that?
You can go ahead.
Okay. And so that would be my case for those businesses who are trying to start it. And then suppliers, I would say, it's, the way you get ready as a diverse supplier is the way all suppliers get ready. Don't get me wrong. I do think that folks who have supplier development functions do have to take a different lens. It doesn't mean that they are sacrificing, and it doesn't mean that they're lowering their standards. But the truth of the matter is that, folks who are incumbents, who have been around for a long time, have a little bit of an advantage. But it's the basic fundamentals that you would do on any call or business development call. You need to understand the business that you are looking to do business with. And I think in today's age, procurement folks and business folks are really looking for new and innovative solutions. So come to them with a solution to a problem that you think you can solve. And then the other thing, and it goes back again, and I know he's going to get tired of me saying his name, but you got to listen. Like David said, I cannot tell you how many diverse suppliers have come to me. And one thing that I say, I'm very approachable and I will expect, I'm like, do not call me. Send me an email. What do they do the day that I'm back from a trade show? They call me. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's like really simple stuff. And then the other thing I always say is sometimes you may not be ready. I mean, everybody wants to do business with a Coke or a Cargill or anybody on this call. But it's not always straightforward, unfortunately. And so be sure that you really truly can do business, and also look for opportunities to do B2B with other diverse suppliers. I really think that sometimes is a better way to become successful and build on and look for opportunity with larger players, or understand maybe if there are other large suppliers that do businesses with the Cargills and the Coke, and maybe you can be a subcontractor. So there are a lot of ways to be successful, but the most important way is to understand your business model, understand their business model, and make sure that you're providing solutions to problems, issues, or concerns that those companies have.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would say for supply, I'm sorry, Ayana, but for suppliers, be patient. And I think that's the other piece of it, that you're not going to get a PO just because you spoke to your supplier diversity liaison. And really, we are the conduit to help you get into the company from a discussion standpoint, but we're not the ones signing contracts or issuing purchase orders. The other piece of it is for the corporations, I really believe that corporations have to look at supplier diversity as part of their business plan, as how they plan their category strategy. And so if you're not doing that today, and we're doing that at Cargill today, we're actually using Hackett's kind of their top list of what should be highly successful categories. And so we're taking that list of those highly successful categories according to Hackett and their study, and we're ensuring that their supplier diversity has a part of that category strategy. So really looking at how am I sourcing, what am I doing? And that's on the indirect side. And then on the direct side, your supplier diversity opportunity may be a tier 2. So the way we buy cattle isn't directly with cattle ranchers, we buy through feedlots. So you'll never really be a direct supplier to Cargill unless you own a feedlot. So that's the opportunity, and the supplier diversity leaders really need to know your supply chain. So if you have experience in buying, that's great. And if you don't, then start to figure out how do you start to get some of that experience so you can speak the language. You also know when your category people aren't really telling you the whole skinny either.
Yeah, that was a wealth of knowledge and information from both of you. I want to move us forward, understanding we have an hour and there are lots of questions coming into the chat. One I want to ask the both of you, or either of you, one of you can take this. It asks, with the number of retailers starting supplier diversity programs, how can we encourage small up-and-coming suppliers to get third-party certified? You all kind of talked about this a little bit. When they either don't see the value in the past or can't afford the certification, what role should certifying organizations play, and what role should retailers play in these efforts? I think, Natalie, that may be a good question for you.
Yeah, well, I think the role that there's a lot of agencies out there, so know the landscape. And there's groups here in Minnesota called PTAC, which will help you go through the process of certification. There's third-party consultants that have been supplier diversity leaders who do this for a living now. I mean, there's opportunities. So there's free services, there's pay-for services, and your supplier diversity liaison, that leader at the company, can point you in the right direction. Sometimes starting with the government agencies is the best way, depending on the size of your company. We at Cargill have partnered with one of our suppliers of safety. So a tool called Avetta actually measures the safety and says, are they ready or able to come on site to do work? That company, along with Cargill, will give a type of scholarship or grant to help you get certified. So those are the kinds of things you need to understand, that landscape. But certification, and I think Terrez said this yesterday, is your gateway to networking. How did you say it, Terrez?
I can't remember, but I do think I said something. I think you said it better. I said it inspires networking, it inspires B2B, and it inspires growth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I would add to what Natalie said is, in the retail sector is a little bit different. You are probably going to have some smaller suppliers that there is an affordability issue. And I would say, I know in the case of Coca-Cola, for smaller suppliers who really could add value to our business, we actually started them out with self-certification, and we worked with them to identify developmental opportunities. But what I would say in the long run if, you know, especially when you're thinking about larger companies, if certification and again, I'm not making any excuse for the third parties who have bureaucratic processes, but if certification, if it's cost enabling and you don't want to deal with the bureaucracy, more than likely it's going to be as difficult for you to deal with some of the larger corporations that you might want to deal with. But I think, as Natalie says, go to your supplier diversity liaison to make sure you understand. And then I strongly discourage trying to get all of the certifications at once. That just doesn't make economic sense. I generally encourage folks to, you know, look at the organization, figure out what they're trying to do, and then make a decision based on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. We do have a follow-up. Natalie, you talked about the Black Farmer Equity Project. And so a follow-up question that we have here from one of our participants is, will that data or that information be shared broadly, or is it for the use specifically of Cargill?
No, we'll be sharing what we're doing. I don't know, our data is the same data as everybody else has. We know that Black farmers make up less than 1% of the farmers in the U.S. We know that systemic racism has been a part of that, and lending and being able to get crop in time and things like that has all given way to where we are today. And so we did have a press release that went out. So you could just Google search Cargill Black Farmer Equity, and we will be sharing specifically with USDA and customers where we are with that process and what we'll be doing. Yes.
And I'm
right,
out of my tip here, but I wanted to ask Natalie a question. Natalie, is NMSDC, I know they at one point they were really trying to look at how they could level set with the farming community, understanding that their margins were a lot slimmer than some of the other business. Have they made any progress on that in terms of possibly having farmers certified? Okay. That's something I think could really be a breakthrough in the farming space if the third party organizations. So I say lobby.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you know, I actually have a meeting with Maria on Friday. Thank you, Terrez.
And that also is a really good segue, I think, to our next question. Natalie, you talked about that 1% of Black farmers. The question was raised, with the cost of land and equipment being in the millions, how do we incent more diverse farmers to get into agriculture? And then what role should government play in supporting farmers of color?
Well, not to get on my soapbox about politics, and Terrez knows me, but the new administration really is focusing, and they've made that announcement of the $5 billion. And part of our initiative with Cargill will be for those new farmers, you know, bringing in those organic farmers, those micro farmers, where we hadn't really thought of. We always think of the large corporate farmers that have, you know, hundreds of acres. So there's specifically a place in the supply chain for those smaller farmers. And when you think about ready to eat and the movement towards more people thinking vegan versus or vegetarian, there's definitely a place for those micro farmers. And we'll be talking about that, yeah. But the barrier is the cost, and we understand that. And we hope to be able to help with that.
Thank you. Terrez, did you want to tackle that, or you feel like Natalie?
Yes, well, I think she did cover it. The only thing that I would say, and Natalie and I have a lot of conversations about things like this, is that there is, you know, with interest rates being low, there are a lot of organizations, and that shouldn't say a lot, but there are about 2 to 3 major minority finance organizations that are looking to invest in traditional and non-traditional minority businesses to grow more Black businesses. And I can actually give Natalie some information on that. I know William Seifert Capital is doing that. And then there was a recent announcement by Melanie Hobson. I don't know if they've thought about the ag space, but that might be something that the community should consider. I actually sent a text when I saw the question come up. I'm hoping that my guy from William Seibert will come back and tell me, but that could be an opportunity. I think that that's probably one of the reasons that the discussion kind of happened. It's one of those problems that, you know, if you solved it, it could really open up opportunities, but the economic dynamics don't necessarily work. So yeah.
Right. And the government should be helping. There's supposedly lots of opportunities. And so even though we have other farmers that have benefited from these government programs, Black, brown, Hispanic farmers, people of color just have not traditionally benefited. So this will help with that. And then we also have the Business Consortium Fund through the NMSDC, which is also an opportunity for small businesses, farmers or not. And they talk about the level 1 and 2 level of certification. So if you're a certified National Minority Supplier Diversity company, you are able to apply for those grants and loans.
So another question that's come in, thank you for that response, is, and it also kind of piggybacks on what you were just talking about, Natalie. The question asked, so how can we move people beyond a zero-sum perception that by supporting one group of suppliers, we disadvantage the other? And then how do we encourage really just a more holistic discussion about these issues?
Well, because we're focusing on Black farmers, because Black farmers have been kept out of the process. I mean, so there's no dispute that systemic racism, and that's the reason why they have not prospered like everyone else. So it's not about leaving somebody out, but it really is about recognizing and being intentional around where the problem is. And that's what supplier diversity is to me. So if I'm looking at my company and my spend profile, and 80% of my spend is with Caucasian women, and 20% is with minorities, but 10 of that 20 is, or 50 of that 20 is with veterans, and 2% is only with Hispanics, and less than 1% is with African Americans, I got a problem. And so it is around equity, and everybody has seen the fence where everyone's trying to look over the top, and some people just need a little higher place depending on where they started from. And that's the issue. It's not about leaving anybody out. I don't know, Terrez, you want to tackle that?
And I would say all of that, I agree with that. And my add-on is not necessarily fact-based, but here's what I would say is that in this digital age, you can't get away from the fact that consumers and customers have a stronger hand in leveling the playing field. And the old way of kind of not sharing information and being able to manage and control is done. And so there is definitely a mandate and an imperative, and there's an advocacy. So, so generally when those conversations are raised, it's to blunt the conversation and to kind of move into a guilty phase, which can only work for a while. I just think the world is evolving in a way that most people get it, and we can fight it, but eventually, what's happening is going to overcome it. And again, your consumers, your customers demand it. I think that the pie there's a lot of opportunity. So it's not really a zero-sum game. It really is about everybody being competitive to grow the pie so that each and every one can participate as long as they're qualified. So if you think of it as a zero-sum game, you have a mentality of, you don't have a mentality of prosperity. I can't remember, there's a word that I'm looking for, but I just don't think we can grow as an economy if we look at it as a zero-sum game. There is enough for everybody to contribute as long as they're competitive and they're adding value. And then Natalie's conversation kind of, educating on equity is important too. But a zero-sum game to me just kind of has a negative connotation, and it just assumes that there's no opportunity for growth.
Right, and for Terrez and I, when you start like that, we're ready. We love those kinds of conversations because I'm all about educating someone on the reality of equity in what we do. And that's the most important piece. And I think the other point we talked earlier around is the economic impact. So when you look at the economic impact, the suppliers that we have and where the impact is in the communities, if we're not getting to the right places, we're doing the wrong thing. So those are also, companies need to have local programs. How do we grow small businesses in our backyard? Most companies I've been in sourcing for years, we go to the big people, we buy from one big provider, trying to leverage our spend across 80% of our supply chain versus a local strategy. And so when you look at some of your members, some of your retail grocers, they have a buy local strategy. It works and people like it. It's just like what Terrez is saying, your consumers like it, your employees like it. And so large corporations haven't necessarily in the manufacturing space, food manufacturing, we haven't gotten there yet. So we need to get there.
And I also think it opens up new markets. Like, for example, I'm in Atlanta and I have chosen to live on the South Side, which is a primarily minority community. Now, obviously, there are pockets of, they're more lower wealth individuals than, say, someone like me. And all of a sudden, many of the retailers are understanding that we've had these little grocery stores who have just been making a ton of money. And now you see popping up these, stores that are making good money. So it really is economic. You just got to kind of get out of that scarcity mentality, because I think the reason why commerce isn't in some of those places is there were assumptions that just don't hold true anymore.
Well, I want to jump in here and pause and just remind our audience that we would love to get your questions and answers through the Q&A function. So please go ahead and continue to send your questions in. As we move forward, I do have a question for both of you, and it talks about the fact that both of you have been in supplier diversity for quite some time. And this was a question that I had, so I'm glad one of our audience members also had the same question. It will move us forward about progress. So what are some of the milestones that you've seen as far as progress in growing a more diverse supply chain across the food system? So we talk about progress, company success stories, organizations who are doing it well. Any of those things are on the table.
Well, I think neither Natalie and I have been in it for a long time, but I would say that I would agree because of the pace of change of commerce with digitization and what have you. We've seen a lot of progress in terms of, people are moving away from the notion that it's a program and they're really building metrics and goals into their business plans and their procurement plans. So there are a lot of companies who are entering the space. There are a number of companies that are aspiring to be in the $1 billion roundtable. There are a number of CPOs who see the innovation that diverse suppliers bring, the fact that they have more access to different suppliers. And so you're not limited to having a limited number of suppliers. So I think the fact that you had about 30 people or more, 30 companies or more to sign on to NMSDC's commitment after the social justice, I think that's the sign of commitment. I think most of the supplier diversity organizations actually thrived in some degree. Well, they may not have thrived, but they did not lose a beat in terms of fundraising, because I think corporations, everybody has said it, that diverse businesses really pivoted and came through during COVID because all their production wasn't overseas. They didn't have a lot of bureaucracy, and they were able to convert a lot of their production to meet COVID needs. The answer now becomes, will these corporations continue to support these diverse businesses and help them to do things that are other than COVID? So I do think the number of corporations that are involved is a number. I think spend across categories is increasing. And I think there are a lot more diverse suppliers coming into non-traditional spaces because of the age of digitization, the omni-channel and marketing, the ability to be agile, and the fact that, the whole move towards consolidation, people are starting to second guess that, because we may not have another pandemic, but we're going to have ways that we can be closer to production and inventory.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the other change has been the, like Terrez said, there were 30 companies that immediately signed on to NMSDC's pledge for equity. And really what they were saying is, how are we going to address this issue? She was number one. Coca-Cola was number one. I was trying to be number one. And so I'm always following my sister Terrez, but we at Cargill really decided that this fiscal year, we were going to make a difference. And so we've given a couple grants to NMSDC, whereas we had not ever done that in the past. So I think that's a huge change going forward. Companies need to be more willing to do that. The other piece, I think, is our Tier 2 program. And so you may hear a lot about that if you're in supplier diversity, or if you're a supplier, like Terrez said, you may not supply Coca-Cola or Cargill or anyone else, but you may supply a supplier that supplies them. So really, we've impacted our Tier 2 program to be more powerful and to ensure that we're working with our large prime suppliers that have big spend, large packaging suppliers that may or may not have a program. So we're impacting that and looking down the supply chain. And you'll hear people talk about Tier 3 as well. So I think that's another way that you can start to see impact in this space, the future.
And it's great to talk about the impact and the progress. I think, as I've heard you all speak today, you've talked about how this work can't be just a program and it can't be just public relations. One of the questions that came in asked, what do either of you see as the next chapter or wave of supplier diversity? And do you think it's just maybe a fad today, or is there a sign of lasting change coming?
That is a great question. I actually saw that pop up and I was like, is Diana going to ask that question? For the last part, here it's like anything. There is some reaction. There are some folks who are defensive, and in some cases, I do think it'll be a passing fancy. Having said that, I do believe that there is a lot of pressure on procurement organizations to innovate, to expand the suppliers they look at. And they really did, in some cases, see the difference that diverse suppliers made. And I just think digitalization, to me, I keep saying it over and over again, and I know people use it, but it truly is the equalizer. And when you equalize in the way digital has, equity is just a natural component. The good old boy network breaks up. Information means something different. One of the reasons I was a little bit late signing on to the pre-call is I got a quick call and about a week ago, and someone called me and said, I know you don't want to consult, but we really need you because there's a major corporation that wants to understand Coke's journey. And I was just on that call, and this company had not, just wasn't known for supplier diversity. They were very focused on cost cutting. They weren't trying to build brand. And so when I got that call, I said, okay, I think I want to talk to them because I say my life's work is supporting this. So I would say I do think that procurement officers and CEOs who are looking at the world 20 years from now do see the benefit in having inclusion in their supply chain. And there are some companies that are doing it as a reaction, and you can't do anything about that. That happens. So I would say yes. And I would say, to me, the trend is around digitization, around, you've got money going in, you've got money opening up to minority businesses to create. And what a lot of this money is, it's not just about making current minority businesses larger. It's about looking at smaller, medium-sized companies that may not be minority, investing in them and finding minority partners who have experience in this to have large companies immediately versus the perception of mom and pop. So I think equity financing is another trend. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for those of you who are diverse suppliers to get on Google and do the research. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of opportunities for diverse suppliers to be developed, to get money, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you do when you're in retirement, right? But they're all legit. And the money is out there in some cases.
Yeah, and I agree with everything Terrez is saying. I think the the recent events of the past year and very recent event of the Asian murders that happened in Atlanta just show over and over, the disparities that are created and put on our communities, not necessarily that we created these issues, right? Here are business owners who are going about their day, doing what they do because someone may not like them, thinks it's okay to go in and do what they did. And so corporations came out, and you know who they are. So if you're diverse suppliers and you're not following these corporations that came out with Stop Asian Hate or who are supporting Black Lives Matter, then you're missing the boat. And I tell suppliers all the time, make a list and hit those companies up and talk to their supplier diversity team and say, hey, I see you made this impact statement. What about us? How can I get into your company? How can I move forward? What are the options for my category that I support? So I think that whole piece of it, supplier diversity, really brings in more than just the supplier. We also focus and work with our DE&I groups to ensure that we're thinking holistically about supplier diversity or diversity and inclusion overall. And as well as our business resource groups or employee resource groups, our sales teams. I'm meeting with a customer after this call. I've been doing that more and more since George Floyd, even more with, the Asian issues. I mean, things like that. And so you have to be ready as a supplier diversity leader to be able to jump in and work on those issues as well. Intersectionality is huge. And I think, and it goes back to that zero-sum game. One group isn't more important than the other. You just have to know what's the focus for your organization, where you need to go, and be open to it.
So as we're winding down, we have just a few minutes. There's one more question as we talk about corporations and their role and the work ahead being long-term work. I want to talk about accountability and metrics, and so we'll end with this question, and then I'll wrap us up. What measures of accountability can you suggest for companies to put tangible metrics to monitor and really manage progress on their DEI initiatives and their real-world impacts? Accountability and metrics.
Yeah, I would say, again, I think that especially if you're just starting, keep it simple. This isn't rocket science. I mean, I think with supplier diversity, it goes back to how much you're spending with diverse suppliers. You may want to include certified suppliers. How much are you spending as a percent of your total spend? How many diverse suppliers do you have, and are they increasing? How many diverse suppliers are you including in the RFP? I'm not a diversity expert, but I do know that a lot of companies are looking at the number of, what you find in a lot of companies is that you've got a lot of minorities at the below director level, and where you really need proactive action is how are you increasing at the senior levels, because it kind of is a snowball effect. If you don't have minorities in leadership or diverse candidates in leadership, you're not going to have that viewpoint, and you're not going to necessarily have a pipeline of candidates. So, it's the number of diverse candidates you have, how many you have in leadership, and what have you, that you should look at. And you've got to and the thing of it is, if you're serious about it, you do have to build those into decision makers' performance. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are very hesitant to do that. And even though I know, Ayana, you said this is the last question, the first question about barriers, I would say the main barrier is resources. If you're not going to invest in these programs, then don't do it, and look at creating a risk mitigation strategy. And that's okay. I mean, people will, but it's better to do it in a way that you can be successful. And if you can't, then develop a risk mitigation strategy with your public accounting your public affairs folks. I just think that was an important question, but sorry.
No, I think exactly what you said. And so when you think about that piece of it, so I always say there's two programs, right? When you think about supplier diversity, there's a reporting piece, that people, that's the tactical side, right? I report my spend, number of suppliers, so on and so forth, very tactical. And so if you look at where sourcing and procurement has moved over the years, they've moved from being very tactical, I report my savings and that's all I do, and number of suppliers, to more impact. And so, and supplier diversity has to do the same thing. And we, you know, at Cargill, I always have acronyms, and my acronym for supplier diversity is SALT. And so I focus on spend and advocacy. I focus on leadership, and I focus on technology. And those 4 areas are where I spend all of my time. And out of each one of them, of course, there's tentacles, some is tactical, some is strategic, but you really are focusing on the right things for what you're doing. And like Terrez said, if you're not ready to move to a more strategic program, then focus on the reporting piece and get that right. But don't do it for 30 years, because that's how long we've had our program at Cargill. So for 30 years, you know, for 20 of those 30 years, it really was reporting, just making sure we got our information out, and we weren't really being very strategic around how we approach supplier diversity. I would say for the last 11 years, they brought in people who had that kind of expertise, and then we moved forward from there. So that's how I would look at it. Tactical, strategic, where do you want to be?
So as we wrap up, we've got 3 minutes. I want 30 seconds from each of you. If you could leave our audience today with the one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation in 30 seconds. I know that'll be a challenge. What would that be? 30 seconds from both of you.
I'll start. What Terrez said. Oh, I'm sorry. Go on. Oh, I was going to say resources, and ensure that you have leadership commitment from the top. Your CEO and the board have to be on board of what you're going to be able to do. And if you don't, focus on the reporting and stay tactical. Don't kill yourself trying to go forward with something that's never going to work if the company isn't there yet.
And I would just say allyship is such a critical component. Role model behavior, pushback, and it's not that complicated. When you know, it's sort of like what it says, like pornography, you know, when you see it, when you see something that's not ensuring belonging, inclusion, etc., speak up. You're in places that people like me aren't in. And if you just say one thing, and I've seen it happen, it will make a difference. So everything Natalie said, but role modeling, allying, it's not that complicated. You know, we all kind of know when we are seeing something wrong. You feel it, and just, you know, just act on it.
Yeah, copy the GID department. That's what I say. Go over to HR and check out what they're doing and how many people they have to focus on this, and ask for a tenth of that. I mean, seriously, there is such a disparity between all the resources that go to that group and the consultants and things like that don't come over to supplier diversity. Start to partner, the allyship, start to build those relationships. That's the strategic piece of what your job is.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been such a robust conversation. I've been trying to jump in. You all didn't need me to facilitate today. You all were both forth here, but it was definitely a very robust dialogue today, and I thank you so much. As we wrap up, I want to thank both Natalie and Terrez for being with us today for the conversation around supplier diversity. As we close, I just want to bring your attention to those 4 agreements, understanding that today, again, is a part of a conversation, but we want to ask you to continue to take these agreements forward as you continue to have conversations in your organizations, and remember how they can support, again, these transparent conversations that help to move us forward and bring us together. So you can see those listed there on the slide. And then also, today is, again, a beginning. We continue to have dialogue. So watch out for CFI emails on social media to learn more about the CFI and the FMI RJID initiative through events like today's dialogue. This initiative will highlight examples of companies and people like our guests today who are doing an excellent job addressing racial equity, inclusion, and diversity across the food system. So we continue to ask you to watch out for those emails and more opportunities to engage in this way. Also, we'd invite you to also visit foodintegrity.org for more resources around this journey for food integrity, as well as racial inclusion and justice throughout the food system. So lots of ways to continue to engage and keep the conversation going. Again, thank you to Terrez as well as to Natalie on today, and we thank all of you for joining us. Have a great day. On behalf of FMI and CFI, we wish you a great afternoon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
All right. Have a great day.